For today, I'm going to be discussing access, equity, and quality of education as part of the United Nations Convention on Human Rights and the Sustainable Development Goals. So I think we're going to be providing this conceptual framework for the parameters by which the state of every country with an educational system can be evaluated as being supportive of protecting the human right to education. So I think this research is responsive to all of the times, as many nation states around the world have invoked emergency powers or taken extraordinary measures to meet the challenges of the COVID pandemic. However, regardless of the difficult context encountered, there is an ethical imperative that the protection of human rights shall continue to be paramount above all. So the conceptual framework that I'm proposing in the research can also be expanded to evaluate other human rights protected under different conventions. So it then becomes a possibility that infringement of or violations of the provisions of conventions as recognized under public international law can be the basis for legal or extra-legal means for enforcement by nation states. So we call upon the members of the civil society, the international communities, and especially for educators to raise awareness on the possible infringement or violations of human rights in our specific nation states. So if I begin with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, specifically for the elements for the protection of the human rights to education, there are three components to this particular right. So the first is the parameter of access to education and the minimum required level, which should be accorded to all, is stated in the first paragraph. So it provides that elementary education and fundamental stages, which is usually identified as early childhood development education, shall be made free and compulsory. So beyond such level, other types of education, such as but not limited to technical, vocational, and higher education, shall be made accessible depending on the condition of every nation state. Now, in the second paragraph, it provides the rationale for education as a tool for the development of humankind. So it provides the qualitative aspect of education to further the aspiration of the United Nations to promote world peace through the mutual understanding between peoples of different nations, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. Lastly, it is also stated in the third paragraph that since elementary education is extended to those of minority age, the parents have the prior right to determine the kind of education provided to their children. So it qualifies the parental authority exercise over their children, indicating the content and manner by which they shall be educated. Now, for the Sustainable Development Goals, we know that these are the developmental aspirations which provide a time-bound international benchmark for countries as articulated by the United Nations. So we had the Millennium Development Goal until 2015, and then it was replaced by the Sustainable Development Goals, which goes until 2030. So this is the basis for the research framework that I have proposed according to the principles of access, equity, and quality of education as already indicated in the fourth Sustainable Development Goals. Now, here's the definition of what access is, equity, and the quality. So very briefly, so access will be defined as the ability of all people to have equal opportunity in education, regardless of their particular categorization. So these include social class, gender, race, sexuality, ethnic background, and physical or mental disabilities. Now, for equity, when we talk about that particular condition, it means that there are not going to be obstacles to achieving educational potential, which is the definition of fairness, and that all individuals reach at least a minimum level of skills, which is the definition of inclusion. So as we know in the UN Declaration, so inclusion will be up until the levels of elementary education. Now, quality in education is achieved when it is delivered with outcomes that encompass knowledge, skills, and attitudes that are limited to national goals for education and positive participation in the society. Now, the first question that we would normally ask when we are utilizing this framework is to evaluate the laws of the state, nation, or country to be analyzed. So in this case, I will be using as an illustration my home country's laws. So what are the laws in my particular country that form the legal basis to support the education? So utilizing this framework provides the conclusion to determine whether a nation state supports the protection of the human right to education, or on the contrary, possibly infringes or violates the right to education. So this study also has a policy impact in supporting future legislation for countries to accord protection towards the human right to education. So it is relevant, again, as education is a major driving force for development prioritized in the SDGs 2030, and it is an ethical concern when the human right to education is either infringed or violated by the nation state. And lastly, the research can be the basis for which a nation state can be enjoined to refrain from the infringement of the right to education or to restore the right when there is a violation. So let's go into the case study. So I start with the fundamental law of the Philippines, which is the 1987 Philippine Constitution. So I identify Article 14, Section 1, when it states that the state shall support education at all levels and shall provide appropriate steps to provide access to such education. Now, this statement is further qualified in Section 2 because then it provides the parameters by which support to education is extended by the state. So even though it's stated in the first section that it supports education at all levels. However, in the second paragraph, it states that it shall have a free public education that is going to be limited to elementary and high school levels. However, based on the UN Convention, this is already over and above that indicated as a minimum level considered as inclusive education. So every nation state in the exercise of its sovereign self-determination can provide for a higher level of support. So that is what is indicated here in the Philippine Constitution. In the third paragraph, for example, it states that there shall be a system of support in the form of resources being allocated through scholarships, subsidies, and other incentives qualifying those who are deserving of such support. Later in the fourth and fifth paragraphs, it provides for an option that can be adopted by the state, providing for the encouragement of non-formal indigenous learning systems as well as independent learning systems if deemed feasible. And lastly, the state can also provide its adult citizens education, however limited to the contents of civics, vocational efficiency, or other similar skills. So therefore, the whole section indicates the quality of education that can be accorded to its citizens on the basis of its content. Now I go to the second level of laws that are enacted, which are in the form of laws passed by the Congress of the Philippines, which are national in scope, and the House of Representatives represent the different districts and party list representatives as elected by the people. So as an example, I go into Republic Act 9155, which is the governance systems for basic education that empowers principals in the different schools on the basis of the principles of transparency and local accountability, expanding their decision-making authority in the school. Then in the next example, this is a landmark law that was passed by Congress in 2013, providing for the adoption of the K-12 basic educational system in the Philippines. So when it was
Water? No. Underwater? Ah, that's good. Punta's ready to be picked up.
No.
No?
the country is better able to provide access to education not only in the Philippines but possibly for its nationals to access other countries' educational system as well. The next two laws, Republic Act 7722 and Republic Act 7796, provide for a differentiation of the basic education regulatory agencies from those over higher education and technical education. In the first example, it provides that higher education shall have autonomy and can exercise academic freedom, whereas for the technical education, the law identifies the agency's thrust towards middle-level human resource training and development. So by analyzing these laws, the framework provides and indicates the data whether nation states are compliant with the parameters of access, equity, and equality for the protection of the human right to education. So here are the primary questions that need to be answered in the research. So by utilizing the Sustainable Development Goals, then the laws can indicate whether the time frame for achieving the goal can be accomplished. So as I said previously, we had the Millennium Development Goals when nation states were not yet able to sustain or achieve those aspirations, then they were revised to make them the Sustainable Development Goals up until 2013. Lastly, the framework is also able to determine whether the state infringes or violates the right to education. So the differentiation between infringement is that you have a gradual non-compliance with elements of the exercise of the right to education vis-a-vis outright denial to the right, which is a violation. So in conclusion, I have identified the possible hindrances that hamper the access to the right of education and which may require action to be undertaken to address the ethical concern of protecting the human right to education. So I will cite some international examples. So in the first condition, for example, the law themselves need to be changed. So I cite the landmark case in the U.S. Supreme Court of Gunter versus Bollinger, wherein affirmative action was deemed untenable and unconstitutional because of the admission of students belong to a particular identified group based on ethnic categorization rather than on the merit, which is against equity of student applicants when the criterion of merit for admission should be the prime determining factor for admission. The second probable condition is that there might be environmental factors outside of the legal system that hamper the promotion of the right to education. So even if there are laws ensuring access to education, cultures of particular communities may prevent those belonging to the female gender to access education, such as early marriage, prioritization of familiar obligation, or physical immobility. So the probable solution here is to promote the protection of the right to education to such communities through education in order to eventually change the culture. The third condition is resource allocation that requires prioritization to address the constraint due to limited resources. So during the pandemic, many students experienced the phenomena of education or learning loss. So this is brought about by the imposition of lockdowns that prevent students from the conduct of face-to-face classes. Therefore, alternative means of delivering the academic programs were adopted. However, some of the means can prove to be ineffectual to the point that it is tantamount to denial of the access to the right of education. So for instance, in the Philippines, since 90% of the basic education student population are in the public educational system, the government may need to provide for budgets to enable students to have gadgets and connectivity to enable delivery of academic programs virtually. If the government does not prioritize such resources, it may be determined to be infringing the right to education if such a critical mass of school children are unable to access the education due to their lack of means. The fourth condition is the state adoption of prohibition on the exercise of the right of education, which could be considered as a violation to the right to education. So when the Taliban first came into power in Afghanistan, the segment of the population belonging to the female gender were prohibited from access to education. Thus, the state policy can be considered as a human right violation. So pressure from the international community and civil society may be a measure which can be adopted to change the state policy. Recognition of advocates for the exercise of the right to education, such as the 2014 Nobel Peace Prize awarded, can highlight the need to change the state policy. So as a parting illustration, around 3 months ago, the President of the Republic of the Philippines made a public statement that those who will be unwilling to get the COVID vaccine will be shot. So using this conceptual framework, could that be considered as an infringement or a violation of a human right? So only if such public statement becomes a state law or policy. Eventually, of course, the presidential spokesperson issued a disclaimer that the president was only utilizing hyperbole in order to emphasize the importance of the COVID vaccine. But if and when such a law is or policy is passed, then it is now up to civil society, the international community, or legal advocates to undertake legal or extra-legal means by which to enforce the compliance for the protection of the human right to life and liberty. So thank you, and I'll be willing to take any feedback or comments on my presentation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, April. Yes.